Welcome to COM 370, week number 2, and this week we are looking at some basics within communication, more along the lines of focusing on the foundational elements that help us to understand a little bit more about the perspectives in communication and how it influences the listening process. So, to begin, I really want you to be thinking about, in communication, how exactly would you define it? Not looking at a textbook, not thinking about, oh, what would my professor want me to say, but actually how you would define it. And whether or not your definition may match other students in the class. And in what ways may it differ? What qualifies as communication and what does not qualify as communication? Well, these sorts of questions plague all communication scholars and professors and those that are students in communication classes all across the world. And as we define communication and try to understand the different perspectives there are on communication, you have to keep in mind that there is definitely a plurality. That is, we don't all agree on what constitutes communication. And many of you may have even participated in a debate about whether or not intrapersonal communication is really communication, because it can get quite divisive sometimes. But there are some things that we agree upon, and we'll be talking about those in more details. First, though, I do want you to understand what the term perspective is. Because as we take a look at the different perspectives on communication, you need to understand that a perspective is basically a way of viewing or seeing a particular phenomenon. And it's really interesting to me because I enjoy photography and I am not a photographer. So anyone in this class that is photojournalism, I am not trying to compete with you to get my pictures in any publication. But I really enjoy photography in the sense that I have the opportunity as the photographer to focus in on an image that I deem important, that I want to capture as my foreground. And in the process, though, I'm going to background other aspects of that which I am viewing. And I will cut certain things out of my photograph altogether. And I may make that decision while I'm taking the picture or later on in an editing program. But what you see in that end product, the photograph that comes out, is my individual perspective when I take that picture. And as we look at the different perspectives on communication, that's what you have to see as well. That these are that particular scholar's view of communication, and that particular perspective is going to be fitting for what that scholar wants to study. So when a scholar is in particularly interested in nonverbal communication, obviously the particular perspective they're going to bring to the plate would be one that focuses on nonverbal. Just as someone who is studying mass media is going to be less interested in the interaction between dyads, that is interpersonal communication, and their definition of communication is going to be more focused on the masses and how message is delivered to the masses. So you have to understand that where you're coming from, your own particular interests are going to affect your perspective of communication, how you define it, how you see it, how you study it. And while some of you may think that the plurality of definitions just seems confusing when you read one textbook and you get a definition for communication, you read another textbook and you get another definition, really and truly that plurality allows many people to participate in scholarship in the communication field and be included within the field. And so it allows for a lot of inclusiveness within our field. That's why we can have people from public relations and those from organizational communication, mass media, those studying interpersonal, those studying gender studies, all within the same umbrella of communication. We are going to be taking a look at a number of different perspectives on communication, and we'll begin with some of the early perspectives on communication. These early perspectives on communication really seem to focus more on the transmission of information. Many have described the earliest perspective on communication as that of an arrow, in the sense that you have an archer that's shooting out an arrow to a target, like a sender sends out a message to a receiver. Obviously, in this particular view of communication, it's very one-dimensional. And the focus is definitely on the sender of the message and how that particular sender is going to construct the message and how they may be able to downplay or modify the message in some way that would get rid of interference. Shannon and Weaver developed the first linear model of communication that really focused on message transmission, and it was one of the groundbreaking but very early perspectives on communication that was really transmissional and one-dimensional. And it focuses also on sequentiality. That is, a message is sent out and it really emphasizes it going out and the sequence of it going out. Now, our perspectives have progressed within the field of communication, and one of the very, I would say, important models that has been modified and added to over the years is what we would label the stimulus response model. And really, unlike the sequentiality of the arrow approach, the stimulus response model is definitely more transactional and it's circular in nature. It really starts to include a lot of the elements of the communication model that we traditionally see represented: speaker, message. That message is encoded, sent out through a channel to a receiver who's going to decode the message that will then react in a form of feedback, and that then sends another message to the speaker. And in many ways, we look at the speaker and listener as interchangeably taking on those roles, but we don't necessarily look at it as much as simultaneously taking on the roles as listener and receiver, as well as speaker and sender. It didn't have the complexity and dynamism as many of our more contemporary perspectives do, but it definitely added a lot to the communication model that the arrow perspective was lacking. Another perspective that I want to point out to you is the relational perspective. The focus on this perspective is definitely on meaning, not necessarily on the message itself. And some people say, oh, well, isn't the meaning the message and the message the meaning? No, not necessarily. And that's what people who study communication really have started to understand. That the message that is intended by the speaker is not necessarily the message that is received by the listener. And in the relational perspective, the focus is on creating meaning, not on the message itself, because meaning shifts and it changes in the way that it's interpreted by the receiver. This perspective, the relational perspective, is really intended for studying interpersonal and small group interactions. It's not really the perspective or definition of communication or model of communication that would apply to all areas of communication, but there are three interesting elements that this particular perspective helps us to understand and that are really apropos for studying listening in particular. We begin first with perceptual filters. And as you look at perceptual filters, this is a unique framework used to view the world. So it's the way that we see the world. And many of you might think of this as your own self and your own identity and how you filter messages through your own identity. We have different predispositions, expectations. We have different cultures that we participate in and we're tied to. We have past experiences. We have knowledge. We have all these different things that comprise to make up who we are, what we know, and it affects how we are going to filter messages through, and then how we form an understanding and interpretation of those messages. We also have a communication framework. That is a larger frame or lens that we use to construct meaning. And what's interesting is that while we often strive to predict behavior and assume that we can, this leads to a lot of misunderstanding, but within our larger communication framework, most of us are trying to do that. That is, predict what other people are going to do. And some of you are probably snickering like I do at this whole idea that you can predict others, because people surprise you every day. And if you have a roommate, you definitely know what I'm talking about. Also, a third component of this is negotiated meanings and sense making. That is, reality is socially constructed. Meaning is going to vary culturally. Meaning is never completely shared. And that means that we approximate meanings. We don't have complete understanding and interpretation that's exact, that's going to match up precisely with somebody else's meaning that they intend. And so as we're listening to a message, it's important that we understand that, but we don't necessarily use that as an excuse for not understanding and not trying to understand.